All right, this is APAB. We're doing the midterm review, and this is free response 20, part C. It is a non-calculator free response. So we're given the second derivative of g, which is very nice of them because nobody wants to deal with it. And we're asked if g double prime of -1 is positive, negative, or 0. So what's tricky about this is you're not going to be able to find numerical values for a lot of this. You're going to have to use your understanding of sort of this graph to find positive, negative, and 0. So let's go ahead and plug in g double prime of -1. So if I plug this in, I'm going to get e to the f of -1, which we'll talk about in a sec. I'm going to get f prime of -1 quantity squared. We'll talk about that in a sec. I'm going to get a plus f double prime of -1. Again, we'll talk about that in a sec. Okay, so let's look at each of these values individually. The first big trap here, I can't find this. So just to be clear, we cannot find f of -1. It's not going to happen. That's the bad news. But the good news is we don't care. And the reason we don't care is because e to the stuff has to net positive. So it doesn't matter what f of -1 is. F of -1 could be a 0. It could be positive. It could be negative. I don't care. This thing's a positive. Great. The second piece of information is this f prime of -1. Well, this graph is the graph of f prime. So f prime of -1 is a 0. So this guy is definitely a 0. So really, all of this problem is going to boil down to what sign this guy is. Because this is a positive number times whatever this number is. And if f double prime of -1 is positive, my answer is going to be positive. If f double prime of -1 is negative, my answer is going to be negative. So we really have to figure out what is f double prime of -1. Well, f double prime of -1 is the same as the slope of f prime at x equals -1, right? Derivative means slope. Well, this is a downhill slope. F double prime of -1 is negative. Once I know this is a negative value, I'm looking at a positive times a negative. G double prime of -1 is negative. Right? And I justified my answer all along the way by explaining how I got the values I got, right? I got that this was positive because e to the stuff is always greater than 0. So it doesn't matter what f of anything is, right? I got that this is 0 by looking at my graph and seeing that f prime of -1 is 0. And I got that this is negative and explained that I got it by looking at my graph and seeing that it was the slope of f prime at -1. And that's my answer.